In days gone by, a captain of one of His Majesty's best ships in the British Royal Navy could govern the poop deck, or any other portion of the ship, with an iron fist. This was before such insignificant concerns as health and safety rules, child welfare, or human rights became things to worry about. The Royal Navy was a difficult place for a sailor to work in the 17th and 18th centuries, with many punishments meted out for various faults or crimes. The mildest punishments would begin with something more like a slap on the wrist or a humiliating deed. For example, the grog would be watered down, more watch duties might be assigned, lunch breaks might be shortened, or the offender might even be chastised by the ship's lads using wet swabs. These guys had been living in close quarters for a significant amount of time together. In general, more severe punishment was withheld so that it would not have an effect on the overall morale of the crew. However, as we are about to discover, the situation may become even more precarious. Starting. Many of the punishments were carried out in an official capacity, meaning that they were ordered by the captain and recorded in the ship's log. There was no need for a written description of the disciplinary action that was carried out on the scene by the bosun or the bosun's mate, who served in a capacity similar to that of a foreman. As a result, it is possible for it to occur for any reason at any moment. The bosun's mate would always have a concealed weapon on them in case they needed to discipline an unlucky crew member. This weapon was typically a rope that had been knotted, a short whip, or a cane that was referred to as a rattan. When three canes were used together, they were sometimes referred to as the Three Sisters. The term starting, which literally means beginning to beat, was used to refer to these beatings. A bosun's mate may be given the command to start a man and continue until they are told to stop. If his arm started to tire out, another companion would be brought in to continue the punishment. On board a ship, getting beaten up was an everyday occurrence like any other. A mate has the authority to hit a rebellious sailor at any time. When left unchecked, a sadistic bosun's mate was capable of, and frequently did, cause great injury to others. In the end, this was the cause of the commencement of their persecution in the year 1811. Gagging. When a sailor committed other minor infractions or became a little bit too lippy, this was the punishment that they gave them. His wrists and legs were tied behind his back as a kind of discipline for him. It was decided that an iron bolt would be placed in his mouth, and then he would be fastened in position from behind his head. He would then be left for however long the officer decided was appropriate for the offense. Remember the scene from the movie Pulp Fiction where the character puts pool balls in his mouth? Another disciplinary action that was taken, but not noted in the logs because of the potentially devastating consequences of doing so. The Admiralty did not approve of the practice, hence, it was never used as part of the formal disciplinary system. Despite this, it was utilized in a number of different contexts. In 1867, a crew member on the HMS Favorite named George Addison was gagged for being intoxicated and violent. Within the space of 2 hours, he passed away due to asphyxiation. Flogging. Even though we have all heard about flogging, it's possible that you are unaware of how cruel of a punishment it may be. This was one of the more typical forms of discipline handed out by the Royal Navy. This form of torture is a potential punishment for almost every offense. The condemned person would be flogged with a cat-o'-nine-tails, which is a type of whip that has 9, often waxed and twisted tails. When it was time for a sailor to be flogged, he would spend the day on the upper deck of the ship being restrained in leg irons. This was done so that he would have more time to make the cat. Indeed, you have it correct. The unfortunate individual would be required to fashion his own weapon of suffering. It is possible that the punishment will be raised if he decides not to create it, or if it is not completed on time. After a period of 24 hours, the fun finally started. The entire crew would gather on the deck to watch the punishment being handed out. The rule that had been breached by the offender would be read out loud from the Articles of War, which is a series of rules that a ship is expected to observe. The question of whether or not the sailor had anything to say in response to his punishment would then be posed to him. After having his shirt removed, he would then be tied standing to a component of the ship, most frequently the rigging or the entrance to the gangway. The bosun's mate enjoyed the privilege of being the one to administer the punishment. He would approach the man from a distance, keeping an arm's length between them, and strike him with the force of a full swing. By the year 1750, the number of lashes that may be administered was capped at 12. However, this did not prevent the man's back from becoming swollen like a pillow and looking black and blue, as stated by the ship's doctor. It was possible for a captain to get around the regulation of 12 lashes by charging a man with many infractions, each of which resulted in a punishment of 12 lashes. Before, a sentence might have had hundreds of strikes as part of its total. After a dozen floggings had been administered, a replacement partner may be requested so that the severity of the blows would not lessen. As the cat proceeded to rip at the flesh of the man with each strike, the man's back may eventually wind up looking like a piece of meat off a butcher's table. Following each stroke, the bosun's mate would wipe the blood off of the tails by running his fingers through them. Sometimes, upon switching to a new companion, the following one would be left-handed so as to cross the slashes on the back and rip it up even more. This was done in order to increase the amount of damage done. However, the suffering did not stop there. After that, the man was carried to the ship's doctor so that vinegar-soaked paper could be applied to his back or salt could be rubbed into his wounds, depending on which treatment the doctor deemed more appropriate. This treatment was intended to preventing an infection from occurring, although it could be more painful than the flogging itself. Flogging around the fleet. This was very similar to a regular flogging with the cat-o'-nine-tails, but it was more of a show for other people to watch, and it was typically carried out at a harbor where there was a concentration of ships nearby. The crewman in question would be lashed by the bosun's mate after being bound to the mast of a small boat. After that, the boat was transferred to the subsequent ship, when the mate of that vessel took his turn flogging the prisoner. As a result, same behavior was observed on all of the ships, giving rise to the phrase flogging around the fleet. The boat was sometimes followed by a smaller watercraft that included a drummer boy as an extra effect to make the entire process feel even more solemn than it already was. This was done for dramatic effect. The Royal Navy continued to use caning up until the year 1881. Cobbed and firked. You may believe that if a man worked as a cook on a ship, he might get away with committing a few indiscretions without facing any consequences. The answer is no. He was prescribed his very own one-of-a-kind medication. If a cook lost food or let it go bad, they could expect to be cobbed and firked, which is a form of corporal punishment that is not as severe as some of the other forms of punishment. Beating the cook with sand-filled stockings or the bung staves of a cask, the wooden panels that make up a barrel, was an unapproved form of flogging that was done at the time. Instead than inflicting physical pain, this was more of a public shaming on the offender's part. The person who committed the offense in the kitchen was more likely to be stuck as a boy and smacked on the buttocks rather than anywhere else. Nobody wanted to cause the cook so much pain that it slowed down the cooking process to the point that they had to wait longer for their food. Child punishment. When we say as a boy, we should note that the crew of a ship did not exclusively comprise of adult males. Young boys, typically commencing work between the ages of 11 and 12, were employed frequently. Unfortunately for them, the age difference did not prevent them from receiving physical punishment. We are able to deduce from the logs of the ships that have been preserved that approximately 1/3 of all lashings were administered to minors. All boys under the age of 19 who committed even the most trivial infractions were subject at all times to the possibility of receiving a caning. As was the case with the adults, the minor punishments that were handed out to the youngsters were not recorded. This could lead to bullying occurring on a daily basis. In one of the documented cases, a captain was stated to have the practice of caning his boys first thing in the morning. When one of the boys had the nerve to beg, "Please, sir," their punishment was escalated. If the crime committed warranted a more severe punishment, the offender would be ordered to kiss the gunner's daughter. He would have his pants pulled down in front of the rest of the crew, be forced to bend over a cannon, and then be struck on the exposed skin of his rear end. One of the reasons for this, in addition to the fact that it was a more juvenile kind of punishment, was because boys were typically the ones who worked on the rigging. They would be less effective in this work if their hands were whipped. By the middle of the 19th century, this task was accomplished with a cane or birch. But before that, a smaller cat that was sometimes referred to as the boy's pussy would be employed. This was very similar to a cat-o'-nine-tails, except that it had 5 whip ends instead. In the extremely unlikely event that a boy was found guilty and condemned by a court-martial, an adult cat may be used as the sentencing instrument. In the year 1813, this tragedy befell poor Valentine Woods. After stabbing a fellow crew member, the young man, who was only 17 at the time, was given a penalty of 60 lashings on his naked rear. Now that I think about it, maybe Valentine did earn that particular punishment. Falling asleep on watch. Because being on watch on a ship meant being responsible for the safety of everyone on board, this was a very serious infraction. The monotony of life at sea, on the other hand, made falling asleep a common occurrence. If a severe punishment was given for the first offense, there would be no crew members left on a ship when the punishment was carried out. As a direct consequence of this, the repercussions for the sailors would become increasingly severe. This is a punishments that were detailed in the Black Book of the Admiralty for falling asleep on duty. The first time someone broke the rule, a simple punishment would be administered, such as having a pail of ice-cold seawater poured over them while others laughed. It's not that horrible. The following time, his hands were going to be tied behind his back, and cold water was going to be poured into his shirt. There is still nothing to be upset about at this point. The penalty for a sailor who took a third nap while on duty was to be tied to the ship's mast and forced to hold up heavy objects while his arms were stretched out to their full length. The vast majority of the time, these things were cannon chambers. After a while, I started to feel a lot of pain from this. In addition to that, the officer in command had the authority to inflict any form of further agony he saw fit. Mr. Sleepybones' sleeping exploits came to an end after he was subjected to the fourth punishment, mostly due to the fact that he passed away by the time it was finished. He was placed in a basket, and that basket was hanged from the bowsprit, which is the slender mast that projects forward from the front of a ship. He was watched over by an armed sentry who had been given the order to execute the criminal if he attempted to flee the scene. After that, he was abandoned to die of starvation. Nevertheless, the prisoner did have a few choices available to him. Since he would be given access to a knife, he would have the means to slit his own wrists if he so chose. Another option is for him to cut the rope holding the basket together and drown himself in the open water. Hanging from the yardarm. The hanging basket approach was not the only option that might have been used to carry out the sentence. In the 18th century, it was possible to be put to death for committing serious offenses, such as assaulting an officer, deserting one's post, or being found guilty of indecent practices. By the 1800s, this was typically reserved for more serious offenses such as mutiny or murder. Regardless of the nature of the offense, a court-martial could result in the sentence of execution by hanging from the yardarm. A death by yardarm was drawn out and very painful, in contrast to the more current practice of drop hanging, which results in an instantaneous death for the condemned. A noose would be fastened around the condemned man's neck, and his wrists and feet would be bound behind his back. The crew took their positions on the deck to observe. The men who were holding the rope began to pull after hearing a shot fired in the direction of them. The inmate would be run up the yardarm and then left to die of strangling in that position. His body was removed from the scene an hour later. The last time a punishment of this kind was carried out was in 1860, when Royal Marine John Gallagher was put to death for the murder of a lieutenant and the commanding officer of the HMS Leven. He was in serious trouble for stealing brandy. This method of punishment was also utilized by U.S. ships. Keelhauling. During the Age of Sail, this was quite possibly the harshest penalty that could have been given. Keelhauling was practiced on multiple occasions before it was finally outlawed around the year 1720, despite the fact that it was never officially sanctioned by the Royal Navy due to the barbaric and harsh nature it exhibited toward the convicted. On the deck of a ship, with the rest of the crew present, the victim would be exposed to public view by being stripped naked. He would be restrained by 2 ropes at the same time. One of them went all the way beneath the keel that runs along the bottom of the ship. After that, the man would be hoisted over the side of the ship, lowered into the water, and pushed along the keel by the second rope until he emerged on the opposite side of the ship. This could be done as quickly or as slowly as the authorities in command desired, and it could be repeated as many times as they saw necessary. To ensure that the man's torso was aligned correctly with the hull of the boat, a weight was attached to his legs and secured with rope. As a direct consequence of this, numerous people drowned. However, even if that didn't end his life, the man still had other challenges to face. Barnacles would cover the hull of a ship, particularly a wooden ship, when it was submerged in water. They are quite sharp, as any young child may attest to who has fallen on a barnacle-covered rock while playing at the beach. Extremely acute. The barnacles tore the man's flesh apart as though he were being dragged over a gigantic cheese grater with razor-sharp blades. Even if he were to somehow emerge unscathed from this terrible ordeal, he would undoubtedly have the marks of it for the rest of his life. We hope you liked this video. Subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.